On Friday, May 7th, a day dear to this guy's heart, I breakfasted with him at Mr. Thrale's in the Borough. While we were alone, I endeavored, as well as I could, to apologize for a lady. Later footnote tells us this is Lady Diana Beauclerk, who had been divorced from her husband by Act of Parliament. I said that he had used her very ill, had behaved brutally to her, and that she could not continue to live with him without having her delicacy contaminated. That all affection for him was thus destroyed. That the essence of conjugal union being gone, there remained only a cold form, a mere civil obligation, that she was in the prime of life, with qualities to produce happiness, that these ought not to be lost, and that the gentleman, later footnote tells us this is Topham Beauclerk, on whose account she was divorced, had gained her heart while thus unhappily situated. Seduced, perhaps, by the charms of the lady in question, I thus attempted to palliate what I was sensible could not be justified, for, when I had finished my harangue, my venerable friend gave me a proper check. My dear sir, never accustom your mind to mingle virtue and vice. The woman's a whore, and there's an end of it. Wow, Johnson. Faux pas, Johnson. Johnson described the father. Later footnote tells us this is old Mr. Langton. Of one of his friends thus. Sir, he was so exuberant a talker at public meetings that the gentlemen of his country were afraid of him. No business could be done for his declamation. He did not give me full credit when I mentioned that I had carried on a short conversation by signs with some Esquimaux who were then in London, particularly with one of them who was a priest. He thought I could not make them understand me. No man was more incredulous as to particular facts which were at all extraordinary, and therefore no man was more scrupulously inquisitive in order to discover the truth. I dined with him this day at the house of my friends, Messrs. Edward and Charles Dilly, booksellers in the Poultry. There were present their older brother, Mr. Dilly of Bedfordshire, Dr. Goldsmith, Mr. Langton, Mr. Claxton, Reverend Dr. Mayo, a dissenting minister, the Reverend Mr. Trope, Mr. Toplady, and my friend the Reverend Mr. Temple. Hawksworth compilation of the voyage to the South Sea being mentioned, Johnson said, Sir, if you talk of it as a subject of commerce, it will be gainful. If as a book that is to increase human knowledge, I believe there will not be much of that. Hawksworth can tell only what the voyagers have told him, and they have found very little, only one new animal, I think. I said, but many insects, sir. Johnson said, Why, sir, as to insects, Ray reckons of British insects 20,000 species. They might have stayed at home and discovered enough in that way. Talking of birds, I mentioned Mr. Daines's Barrington's ingenious essay against the received notion of their migration. Johnson said, I think we have as good evidence for the migration of woodcocks as can be desired. We find they disappear at a certain time of the year and appear again at a certain time of the year. And some of them, when weary in their flight, have been known to alight on the rigging of ships far out at sea. One of the company observed that there had been instances of some of them found in summer in Essex. Johnson said, Sir, that strengthens our argument. Exceptio probat regulum. The exception proves the rule. Some being found shows that, if all remained, many would be found. A few sick or lame ones may be found. Goldsmith said, There is a partial migration of the swallows. The stronger ones migrate, the others do not. Boswell said, I am well assured that the people of Otahite who have the bread tree, the fruit of which serves them for bread, laughed heartily when they were informed of the tedious process necessary with us to have bread. Plowing, sowing, harrowing, reaping, threshing, grinding, baking. Johnson said, "Why, sir, all ignorant savages will laugh when they are told of the advantages of civilized life. Were you to tell men who live without houses how we pile brick upon brick and rafter upon rafter, and then after a house is raised to a certain height, a man tumbles off a scaffold and breaks his neck, they would laugh heartily at our folly in building. But it does not follow that men are better without houses. No, sir," holding up a slice of a good loaf of bread, "this is better than the bread tree." Now, what the hell's a bread tree? I'm going to look that up later. Johnson repeated an argument, which is to be found in his Rambler, against the notion that the brute creation is endowed with the faculty of reason. Birds build by instinct. They never improve. They build their first nest as well as anyone that they ever build. Goldsmith said, "Yet we see if you take away a bird's nest with the eggs in it, she will make a slighter nest and lay again." Johnson said, "Sir, that is because at first she has full time and makes her nest deliberately. In the case you mentioned, she is pressed to lay and must therefore make her nest quickly, and consequently it will be slight." Goldsmith answered, "The nidification of birds is what is least known in natural history, though one of the most curious things in it." I introduced the subject of toleration. Johnson said, "Every society has a right to preserve public peace and order, and therefore has a good right to prohibit the propagation of opinions which have a dangerous tendency. To say the magistrate has this right is using an inadequate word. It is the society for which the magistrate is agent. He may be morally or theologically wrong in restraining the propagation of opinions which he thinks dangerous, but he is politically right." Mayo said to this, "I have an opinion, sir, that every man is entitled to liberty of conscience and religion, and that the magistrate cannot restrain that right." Johnson said, "Sir, I agree with you. Every man has a right to liberty of conscience, and with that the magistrate cannot interfere. People confound liberty of thinking with liberty of talking, nay, with liberty of preaching. Every man has a physical right to think as he pleases, for it cannot be discovered how he thinks. He has not a moral right, for he ought to inform himself and think justly. But, sir, no member of a society has a right to teach any doctrine contrary to what that society holds to be true. The magistrate, I say, may be wrong in what he thinks, but while he thinks himself right, he may and ought to enforce what he thinks." Mayo answered, "Then, sir, we are to remain always in error, and truth never can prevail, and the magistrate was right in persecuting the first Christians." Johnson said, "Sir, the only method by which religious truth can be established is by martyrdom. The magistrate has a right to enforce what he thinks, and he who is conscious of the truth has a right to suffer. I am afraid there is no other way of ascertaining the truth but by persecution on the one hand and enduring it on the other." Wow. Goldsmith said, "But how is a man to act, sir? Though firmly convinced of the truth of his doctrine, may he not think it wrong to expose himself to persecution? Has he a right to do so? Is it not, as it were, committing voluntary suicide?" Johnson said, "Sir, as to voluntary suicide, as you call it, there are 20,000 men in the army who will go without scruple to be shot at and mount a breath for 5 pence a day. Mount a breach for 5 pence a day." Goldsmith said, "But have they a moral right to do this?" Johnson said, "Nay, sir, if you will not take the universal opinion of mankind, I have nothing to say. If mankind cannot defend their own way of thinking, I cannot defend it. Sir, if a man is in doubt whether it would be better for him to expose himself to martyrdom or not, he should not do it. He must be convinced that he has a delegation from heaven." Goldsmith said, "I would consider whether there is the greater chance of good or evil upon the whole. If I see a man who has fallen into a well, I would wish to help him out. But if there is a greater probability that he shall be put in than that I shall pull him out, but if there is a greater probability that he shall pull me in than that I shall pull him out, I would not attempt it. So were I to go to Turkey, I might wish to convert the Grand Signor to the Christian faith. But when I consider that I should probably be put to death without effectuating my purpose in any degree, I should keep myself quiet. Johnson said, Sir, you must consider that we have perfect and imperfect obligations. Perfect obligations, which are generally not to be something, which are generally not to do something, are clear and positives, such as thou shalt not kill. But charity, for instance, is not definable by limits. It is a duty to give to the poor, but no man can say how much another should give to the poor, or when a man has given too little to save his soul. In the same manner, it is a duty to instruct the ignorant, and of consequence to convert infidels to Christianity. But no man in the common course of things is obliged to carry this to such a degree as to incur the danger of martyrdom, as no man is obliged to strip himself to the shirt in order to give charity. I have said that a man must be persuaded that he is a particular delegation from heaven. Goldsmith said to this, How is this to be known? Our first reformers, who were burnt for not believing bread and wine to be Christ? Johnson, interrupting him, Sir, they were not burnt for not believing bread and wine to be Christ, but for insulting those who did not believe it, who did believe it. And, sir, when the first reformers began, they did not intend to be martyred, as many of them ran away as could. I said, But, sir, there was your countryman Elwal, who he told me challenged King George with his blackguards and his redguards. Johnson answered, My countryman Elwal, sir, should have been put in the stocks, a proper pulpit for him, and he'd have had a numerous audience. A man who preaches in the stocks will always have bearers enough, and hearers enough. I said, But Elwal thought himself in the right. Johnson answered, We are not providing for mad people. There are places for them in the neighborhood, meaning Moorfields. Mayo said, But, sir, it is not very hard that I should not be allowed to teach my children what I really believe to be the truth. But, sir, is it not very hard that I should not be allowed to teach my children what I really believe to be the truth? Johnson answered, Why, sir, you might contrive to teach your children extra scandulum without offense. But, sir, the magistrate, if he knows it, has a right to restrain you. Suppose you teach your children to be thieves. Mayo answered, This is making a joke of the subject. Johnson said, Nay, sir, take it thus, that you teach them the community of goods, for which there are as many plausible arguments as for most erroneous doctrines. You teach them that all things at first were in common, and that no man has a right to do anything but as he laid his hands upon it, and that this still is, or ought to be, the rule amongst mankind. Here, sir, you sap a great principle in society, property. And don't you think the magistrate would have a right to prevent you? Or suppose you should teach your children the notion of the Adamites, that they should run naked into the streets. Would not the magistrate have a right to flog them into their doublets? Mayo answered, I think the magistrate has no right to interfere till there is some overt act. I said, So, sir, though he sees an enemy to the state charging a blunderbuss, he is not to interfere till it is fired off. Mayo answered, He must be sure of its direction against the state. Johnson answered, The magistrate is to judge of that. He has no right to restrain your thinking, because the evil centers in yourself. If a man were sitting at the table and chopping off his fingers, the magistrate, as guardian of the community, has no authority to restrain him, however he might do it from kindness as a parent. though indeed, upon more consideration, I think he may, as it is probable that he who is chopping off his own fingers may soon proceed to chop off those of other people. If I think it right to steal Mr. Dilly's plate, I am a bad man, but he can say nothing to me. If I make an open declaration that I think so, you will keep me out of this house. If I put forth my hand, I shall be sent to Newgate. This is the gradation of thinking, preaching, and acting. If a man thinks erroneously, he may keep his thoughts to himself, and nobody will trouble him. If he preaches erroneous doctrine, society may expel him. If he acts in consequence of it, the law takes place, and he is hanged. Mayo said, "But, sir, ought not Christians to have liberty of conscience?" Johnson answered, "I have already told you so, sir. You are coming back to where you were." I said, "Dr. Mayo is always taking a return post-chase and going the stage over again. He has it at half price." Johnson said, "Dr. Mayo, like other champions for unlimited toleration, has got a set of words. Sir, it is no matter, politically, whether the magistrate be right or wrong. Suppose a club were to be formed to drink confusion to King George III and a happy restoration to Charles III. This would be very bad with respect to the state, but every member of the club must either conform to its rules or be turned out of it. Old Baxter, I remember, maintains that the magistrate should tolerate all things that are tolerable. This is no good definition of toleration upon any principle, but it shows that he thought some things were not tolerable." Toplady, of all people, responds to this. "Sir, you have untwisted this difficult subject with great dexterity." There's a footnote here about Dr. Mayo. Dr. Mayo's calm temper and steady perseverance rendered him an admirable subject for the exercise of Dr. Johnson's powerful abilities. He never flinched, but, after reiterated blows, remained seemingly unmoved as at the first. The scintillations of Johnson's genius flashed every time he was struck without his receiving any injury. Hence he obtained the epithet of the literary anvil. Quite good. During this argument, Goldsmith sat in restless agitation from a wish to get in and shine. Finding himself excluded, he had taken his hat to go away, but remained for some time with it in his hand, like a gamester, who at the close of a long night lingers for a little while to see if he can have a favorable opening to finish with success. Once, when he was beginning to speak, he found himself overpowered by the loud voice of Johnson, who was at the opposite end of the table and did not perceive Goldsmith's attempt. Thus disappointed of his wish to obtain the attention of the company, Goldsmith in a passion threw down his hat, looking angrily at Johnson and exclaiming in a bitter tone, "Take it!" When Toplady was going to speak, Johnson uttered some sound which led Goldsmith to think that he was beginning again, and taking the words from Toplady, upon which he seized this opportunity of venting his own envy and spleen under the pretext of supporting another person. "Sir," said he to Johnson, "the gentleman has heard you patiently for an hour. Pray allow us to hear to him." Johnson sternly said, "Sir, I was not interrupting the gentleman. I was only giving him a signal of my attention. Sir, you are impertinent." Goldsmith made no reply, but continued in the company for some time. Ooh, it's really heating up at that literary guild, or whatever it's called. Well, that was fun. Till next time, bye from Boswell.